Okay, getting ready to start here. Okay. Everybody's ready with their cameras in their hands. Okay. And good afternoon. Welcome to my studio here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. My name is Michael Markowsky, and I'm going to be your photography instructor for the next hour, and then afterwards there's time for some Q&A. So if you have any burning questions about photography that I can try to answer, please leave them in the comments below. So, for the past 4 classes now, we've been learning, firstly, about the basics of photography and kind of what photography is and some basic compositional strategies to help you get better at taking photos, whether you're taking photos on your smartphone, which is what's filming me right now here. That's an iPhone 7, so the quality is, it works well enough for right here. The reason why I'm not filming on a DSLR or a mirrorless camera is going to be evident shortly, because I'm going to be shooting video directly out of the camera. This is just a wireless receiver connecting to the system, so don't worry about that. But this will allow me to show you in real time what the camera sees and how I'm adjusting my settings. So the quality of your iPhone is passable. It takes photos and video, like you can see, but probably not the best thing, not the kind of thing that you would want to use for a film or any kind of really high professional work. But it does work in a pinch. And so my purpose about all of the things we're learning is to get you to feel like whenever you're shooting on a camera like that, you're like, oh, I guess this will do for now, but I wish I had a proper camera with me. So, so we've been learning a little bit about composition, some basic strategies to help make better photographs right now. And then last week, we started learning about how to jump in from the auto mode into manual mode. Right? So the strategy that I showed you how to accomplish that was, firstly, we took photos in auto, and then we learned to find out the basic photo information, the data that says what settings the camera used to take that photograph. So we wrote that down, and then we reproduced it in manual, right? So we jumped into the deep end there for sure, right? So we went from using the basic auto features of our camera, which is, I would say 90% of people do. They have these really nice cameras, but they're stuck on auto. So last week we got off auto, went into manual, and then the second class on Thursday, where we left off, I showed you how not just to kind of go to auto, figure out the settings, and reproduce them in manual, but then use the exposure meter to start taking photos directly in manual. Right? So that was another leap forward. And I understand if some of this is a little bit challenging for people. Maybe we started off slow, and some people are like, this is too easy. And then all of a sudden, whoa, this is kind of tricky. So it does take a little bit of time, and hopefully you practiced with your camera a little bit, because I think if you're practicing, all of this stuff gets easier and easier and easier and easier, to the point where you're like somebody like me who doesn't even think about it anymore. In fact, I'm so used to shooting in manual that sometimes it takes a little bit of a second just to, even remember what I'm doing to be able to explain it to you, because it becomes like muscle memory. And that's ideally where you want to get to, that you can start turning dials if you're in a dark room, whether that's you're shooting photographs of a big event like a wedding, or your children are putting on a play, or it's a birthday party and it's some kind of surprise event, and you don't want to be attracting a lot of attention to yourself, and you want to be able to do this quietly and in the dark. So you start kind of figuring out how to do it all without even looking at the camera, and you're just kind of switching the dials on their own. And I understand that is not, it's not the easiest thing to do, but it takes a little bit of practice, and once you get it, it just becomes muscle memory. So that's where we left off last week, and I suggested trying to take as many photographs as possible using the exposure meter and taking photos directly in automatic. And I think, you know what, usually I wait till the very end to look at some photographs, but Yannick sent me some photos, and I thought maybe it would be instructive just to really quickly take a look at some of those photos that were sent here, if I can now find out where I put them. Okay, so I'm just going to bring these up nice and big. Let's go into full screen, and then oh, I gotta build this 1 second here. Okay, so if you have some photos that you would like to send me for any feedback, do that right now. Send it through Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever other kind of social media out there. I'm usually on one of them, and you can contact Markowsky Art is the username, I guess, or my channel here on YouTube. So you could send those to me, and then send me a little thing in the comment here saying what your photo, where you sent it to, and then I'll dig it up at the very end. But I just thought these are photos that Yannick sent me in Instagram, through Instagram. So, and I think he also sent me the details of what the settings were for these photographs. So maybe we'll just take a quick look at them, and then I'll bring up Instagram and we'll look at the numbers. So we have this looks like a really nice place wherever you went over the Mother's Day weekend. Happy Mother's Day to any mothers, or belated Mother's Day to any mothers watching. So here, this looks like a really beautiful location here. It was a little bit overcast at times on the weekend, so maybe that explains why the sky is a little bit kind of gray or white, or there's not a lot in there, right? So there's no beautiful clouds or big blue sky. It's kind of an undefined mass, which is not a problem if you want, for like documentary photography, to say like, this is what the weather was like. But I do think, you know, if you're in a situation like this and the sky is kind of, you know, a little bit bland, that might be a sign for you to think about maybe lowering the camera and getting, you know, if we're, again, we think of that rule of thirds. If we raise the ground up higher and focus down in the you know, the water or the grass, or, you know, the logs that are the moss, all that kind of stuff, I think that it sort of presents us with an opportunity of like, instead of being, the sky's all, you know, blown out, well, maybe let's look in the ground to see some stuff. So that would be my suggestion for this photograph. There are apps that you can get for your smartphone that will allow you to artificially insert clouds and stuff, which are really fantastic, and I teach that in a different class. But for now, we'll just kind of move forward here. And then same sort of, I mean, we got beautiful clouds up in the sky, but we have this area that is overexposed, right? So that is totally white, so there's really no information here. So in order to get information here, data for the computer to read, you'd have to make what have I done here? You'd have to make the whole picture a little bit darker. So you'd have to underexpose it a little bit to get some of the sun. And then later on, if it's too dark, you could brighten it up on the computer. And so a lesson that I would suggest right off the bat that you want to think about whenever you're using your mirrorless or DSLR camera is to think about underexposing the picture a little bit. So if, again, we think of that exposure meter, and there's 0, and then +1, +2, +3, or -1, -2, -3, is going a little bit onto the darker side if you have a really bright sky like that, or you're photographing a sunset. And then later on, when you get into the computer, you can brighten it up. So I don't think you have a photograph like that, but I'll show you some stuff like this in a few minutes. So this is really beautiful. Nice, big, beautiful sky, big, beautiful, puffy clouds. I also like these cables going across, because here in Vancouver, where I know you took this photograph, one of the aspects of the skyline, if you're living in the city, is all of these cables from, not just, you know, telephone cables and stuff, but we have electric powered transit, right? So everywhere you go, there's these electric cables. So I think this is a really nice photograph, and those diagonals work really nice. I think if those cables had been just a little bit close to straight but off, it would drive me crazy. So I like that they are deliberately off kilter. And this one looks like maybe we'll just use tools to, oops, oh, I want to go the other way. We'll go right. And that's beautiful. This is really nice. So talk about the horizon being very low. That works really well for this, because we now see the sky really well. And it's nice to see this little cyclist, I guess I'm pointing the wrong way, but that little fellow in green, or not green, in red, who's cycling away from us, helps bring our eye right down into the bottom. So it might not be the first thing you see. You might see the sky and the trees, and then you come down, and the trees almost act like a V shape that pulls us down, like leading lines. And then we see this person on the cycle, and then we kind of come back out, and so we get it sucked into the photograph. So I think this works really, really well. You know, there's not really, I mean, there's some darkness in the sides here, but that works really well for framing the picture. So it's, again, we have like a frame within a frame. So these are all fantastic, and I'm just going to see if, where would it be? Got all of these different windows here. So I just want to go back up to, so that was Lost Lake. Okay, so you had f5.6 ISO 100. So I would even think so of this earlier photo here. And you know, even these, if they're not your photos, I think all of this is really, really interesting. It's interesting to me as a photographer to look at photographs and to think about the settings people have used. So I think in this scene here, because the sky is so bright, you know, you could keep on going darker and darker and darker, and then try to brighten this back up later on the computer, which is as easy as if you have a Mac. I wonder if this will, if you'll be able to see all of, oops, not the size. But if, and this is similar, so if I'm in preview where I'm viewing this is all the free software that comes with your computer. If you're using a PC, I believe it's Windows Media Viewer or Windows Photo Viewer or just Photos, just like the Mac. But so this would come up here. This thing on the top here is called the histogram. We're not going to talk about that because that's a little bit more advanced. You could try something like the auto levels. It doesn't appear to make too much of a difference. But we have all of these sliders here, like your exposure, right? And you can you can see how much detail we can bring back out of the shadows, because this was the original photograph. Look how much bright, like all of the shadows we can bring detail back out of. So that's really, and you can do that there. This is even a little bit more fine-tuned, because if we go directly, this is what I always use, whether it's in Photoshop or in software like this or on your phone, is I always go directly to the shadows and bring a little bit of light back into the shadows. If we go into the highlights and start playing with this, it's actually darkening the highlights. And since there's really nothing except white up there, it just kind of goes this weird gray. So that's what's happening there. But this just gives you an idea that if you want to underexpose your photographs, so let's go to, I think it was this one here. And let's try doing the same thing really quickly. So we could we can brighten these shadows up quite dramatically. right? But we can't darken that part of the sky, this area here that is just pure white. All right, so whenever in doubt, 99% of the time you'd want to underexpose a photograph if you're dealing with high contrast. We'll talk about that kind of stuff again later on in the class, but oops. I think, is this the one I want? Sorry, I'm just gonna quickly pull that. Okay, so that's just a little bit of quick feedback on those photographs. And maybe we can talk, well, actually, you know what, I'll just go to this one really quickly just to once again show you that, you know, I said some of this was a little dark, which I actually think works well. Like, I think if we brought up, like, see how you can really bring up the brightness in some of the trees. I mean, you don't want to go too far because then this starts kind of, it just loses information. But you could brighten it up there, and that's still like a, you know, 50% higher than it was. But I kind of like it a little, I might brighten it up just a tad. And, you know, you could darken the sky. See how the sky, I can now, that's the original, and then I'm kind of adding a little bit of contrast back into the sky. So that would be one way that you could do a real quick edit of that photograph. So that would be the original versus, well, okay, so let's, oh, and Maria sent some photos on Twitter, fantastic. So we'll look at those a little bit later on. I want to start talking about today's lesson here. And let's kind of bring this nice and big here. Okay, so on this sheet here that I've just brought up and put up onto the screen, I'm just keep on making it bigger so that we can see as much detail in here as possible. So this is another version of the not the exposure triangle, but I just wrote their exposure cheat sheet to kind of help remind you of what the different settings do and why it's important to, it's really important to know what they do. So, because the last couple classes, what we've done is just played around with the settings, right? We've just been adjusting them to get enough light in to take a picture that you're happy with, right? Because all three of these primary settings, as you see there on the left side, right, it says aperture on the top, shutter speed, and then ISO. So those are the three settings that we need to know for our camera. So, and each one of those three settings controls how much light comes through the lens and makes it onto the sensor and then creates an exposure, right? So three different ways to add more or less light, right? And so that makes sense. That's pretty straightforward. There's three ways. It's sort of like you have three valves on a pipe, you know, or your garden hose, right? There's three little valves, and depending on how open they are, that depends on how much water is going to come shooting out of your garden hose, right? So what we're going to start talking about really today is how changing each of those things radically impacts what the photograph is going to look like. Because you can adjust those settings in all sorts of different configurations, and the amount of light will be exactly the same. So like your exposure meter, whether it's going left to right or up and down, is going to be right in the middle in every single instance. But you can adjust all the settings to all sorts of different settings and have that exposure mirror staying in the same place. So what does all of these things do? Last week we talked about the exposure triangle as kind of a cheat sheet. So here's another way of explaining it. So we're going to talk about aperture all day today and all next class as well. So I'm just going to skip that for just a second. Just really quickly, we'll look at the shutter speed. Shutter speed is the most straightforward of all, I think. It's because we're used to seeing like photographs taken at really, really fast shutter speeds that freeze action, like a runner crossing the finish line. You know, again, at the Olympics, they have lots of cameras shooting at super high frame rates, whether that's video and film too, right? So that they can find out who crossed the finish line at whatever world record breaking speed. So we're used to seeing these kind of photographs. And then as we go across, we start seeing the blur that happens when we have a longer exposure. Now, I would think, you know, I think at first people say, well, why would you want to take a photograph where everything is blurry? That just doesn't make any sense. Well, it will, because I think once you see the power of these long exposures that we're going to take starting next Monday. So on next Monday and next Wednesday, we're going to spend the whole class talking about shutter speed and how to adjust that for really cool images. I think that's going to blow your mind. When you're able to take a photograph in pitch darkness, you know, you can go into your bathroom, close all the blinds, you know, stuff a towel under the door, and then set your camera on a tripod, take a 30-second, 1 minute, 5-minute long photograph, and the results appear like all the lights are on. And that just blows your mind. So we'll see the different effects that can happen when we're shooting long exposure photographs. And then last week we talked about ISO. And the reason why we want our lowest ISO possible is so that we can have the most crisp, noise-free images possible. Right? So in this diagram here on the left, we see two people holding hands, and it looks like a normal photograph, right? Again, it's an icon, not a real photograph, but you get it, right? And then as we start going across here, the picture starts to get noisier or more pixelated as the gain is being turned up, the volume is being turned up on in the photograph. Again, it's like the same sort of thing, the gain on a microphone, turning it. If somebody's whispering and you're, you know, like you see those, if you ever watched The Wire, you know, that television, they're sitting in the van trying to listen to somebody and they're whispering and they're turning the volume all the way up and they can barely hear it and it's all this static. That's the same thing that's happening here when we make our camera as sensitive as possible with the ISO as high as it gets. Now, just one thing you're watching this on YouTube, if you want to blow your mind, is look up, I think it's it's maybe a few years ago now, but some technology, I'm sure it's military grade, like 1 million ISO. And you'll see people filming video in a desert there's barely any stars out, and the video looks like it was shot in the middle of the day. It'll blow your mind. And so that's eventually going to trickle down to our phones and our cameras, but we're not quite there yet. So most camera systems go maybe 20,000, 40,000 ISO would be great. But that allows you to take photographs in really, really dark conditions in real time, but there's going to be noise and grain to it, right? So there's always a bit of a trade-off. With any of these settings, there's a trade-off. So those are different ways that we can allow more and more light into the camera. And on this side here, you can see we have bright sunlight on this side. So if it's really bright, these would be your settings. And then as we go indoors, the settings change. And as we go, you know, when it gets darker and darker and darker, then you want to be into these settings, right? Or some combination thereof. Okay, so this is where it gets exciting. Aperture. We're going to spend the next two classes talking about Aperture. Now, what I think is, I firmly believe that the reason why you have the camera you have, why you spent $200, $500, $5,000, $10,000 on your camera is probably primarily because of the aperture function of your camera and the fact that you can control it so relatively easily as compared to your iPhone or any other like basic smart point and shoot camera or smartphone, because the aperture is what allows you to take photographs that look professional, right? And most photographs these days, 98% of them are taken on a smartphone, and smartphones tend to create pictures where everything is in focus, right? So if you've gone hiking with a friend and you climb up to the top of some hill or mountain, and they pull out their phone and they take a picture of you like celebrating, I'm on the top of the mountain, right? With your smartphone, you're going to see your face in nice sharp focus, and you're going to see the mountain 4,000 kilometers, well, not that far away, but something very, very far. The other mountain on the other side of the mountain range, or the trees on the other side of the valley, or whatever you want to, however you want to put it, right? Everything is going to be in more or less focus. And so we are inundated with photographs that look that way, that have that particular look of what we would call a large depth of field. And we're going to talk about what depth of field is today. But this is going to allow you to see lots of distance, lots of space, right? And to do that, that's at your highest aperture number. As we start moving, what we would call this is opening up the aperture, right? So as we open up and we start going from f32, 22, 8, 4 to 1.4, there are some cameras that can go to f1 or f9.5. What's happening is the kind of iris inside of the lens is opening and opening and opening. So it's allowing more and more and more light into the camera, which is really great, right? That's perfect. Get more and more light, but something is changing. And what that is, it's the depth of field is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, or more and more shallow, right? So in this instance, we go from being able to see this person standing in front of the mountains to slowly the mountain in behind. If you're focused on the person, if your focus is set on the person standing there, then the mountains start to become more and more blurry, to the point where if you're using a lens that can get down to f1.4 or at 1.2, that mountain might be so blurry that we don't even know it's a mountain anymore, right? So the question then and I'll just tell you, everything we're talking about with aperture is super subjective. There are people that love the look of pictures that have a big, deep depth of field where everything's in focus. And then there are some people that despise that. And they're like, it's every smartphone is like that. I want a photograph where it's got a nice blurry background. And that effect of a blurry background, the $1 million word that you've probably heard of, is called a bokeh. Or bokeh, which is technically not correct. Bokeh is the right one. Maybe I'll zip to here on the handout. So here's this term that I'm just bringing up here, bokeh. And so it's a Japanese word that means blur or haze. And a great number of people find that look to be very pleasing. And it works really well for portrait photography. So that's why you see it on the cover of like fashion magazines or fashion ads, and you see it in photographs of animals. So a lot of wildlife photography uses this shallow depth of field bokeh quality. So I'm going to use that term throughout the rest of the class. So let's jump into this here. So here's kind of just some text for your reading pleasure. And so I've used this term depth of field a few times, right? So I just want to throw a couple definitions out here. So depth of field is defined as the area in front of and behind the subject that is in acceptable focus, right? So if you're taking a picture of me, the depth of field is how much of me and in front and in behind me is in acceptable focus. So right now, filming on this iPhone 7, right, it has a deep depth of field. So you could see me, I'm in sharp focus, and then you can see this cloth, and you know, probably if you had like a 4K display, you'd probably might be able to see some of the texture of the backdrop, right? And I can hold my camera a little bit in front of me, and we can, it's kind of hard for me to see, but it looks like you should be able to read some of the text on the front of the camera as well, right? So there's the depth of field is large here, right? So if I was taking a photograph and there was maybe, you know, it's like a chorus line or something, and there's 8 people standing, you know, right in a line behind one another, and people are looking out on either side, having a larger depth of field or a higher f-stop number means everyone's face is going to be in focus, right? So, but if we were doing something different, let's say I wanted this to be blurrier, then I'd want to open up and have a smaller number so that depth of field shrinks. And I'm going to show you some photographs here in a second. So, and actually I'll just show you this image here. I should move this onto the other page, but this again helps show the difference here. So here's f3.5, which is a very common setting for the kit lens that comes with your camera. Right, so here's the photographer taking a photograph of a bird on a tree. So this is a shallow depth of field. So, and the key sentence here is low aperture number, shallow depth of field. The less things are in focus, the smaller the number is. The bigger the number, the bigger the depth of field is. All right, so shallow depth of field, f3.5. So we see this little bird on the tree, and the area in front of the bird is out of focus, and the area behind the bird is out of focus. Now what we do is we call it like stopping down. So we go to f11, so that is getting smaller, a little opening gets smaller, and now the depth of field has increased here. All right, so now not only do we see this bird in focus, but the other birds in front and behind it are in focus. But there's still some stuff on either end that are out of focus. And then we go even further, f22, which might be the highest number your lens might be able to go to. There are some that go a little bit higher, but for our purpose, let's say f22. So that means now we see the bird in focus, and we see all these other birds and the tree in focus as well. So this is a deep depth of field, a medium depth of field. I wonder if might have had a little bit of dropout with the video here, so I'm just curious if you experienced any problems there. If everything's all right, let me know. Okay. So I'm just going to move. In fact, let's... Everyone's still there? Oh, oops, I did the wrong thing here. Let's make that bigger. Okay. So this is a photograph. Oops, let's move this here. That I took just a couple days ago of my daughter in a local park here in Vancouver. And this is the raw photograph right out of the camera. Sorry, this is a JPEG image right out of the camera without any editing at all. So in this instance, we have a shallow depth of field, right? So we can see her. We can see, you know, I can even, we can zoom in, right? I can see her beautiful eyelashes and eyebrows, right? And I can see the texture of her jacket. And you can see here's this button on her jacket, and this is in focus. But look at this button here. This button is, right, so we've got, yeah, I'm looking the same direction, right? So this button is in focus, but this button, which is just that much closer to the camera, is now a little bit out of focus. That's how shallow this depth of field is, right? And so we can see all of this is a nice sharp focus. We can see the hairs on the top of her hat. So all of that is a nice sharp focus. But look what's happened to the background. The background, we have this bokeh, right? These little bokeh balls, as people would say, these kind of little sharps, these little circles. Like they kind of look like little light bulbs or something, right? They've been formed, right? And as I go across here, I'll just bring this down. So here's a little sign in the park, and I cannot read any of the text on the sign. You know, you look at it like, what am I looking at here? What does that say? Kind of, I don't know. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it says. I can't see. So this effect with a shallow depth of field, and I think this was, I think f3.9, something like that. In fact, one thing I can do on my computer is I can find out, this is Command I on a, actually I'll just so you can see how we would find this. I go up to, this is preview on a Mac. On a PC, the same sort of thing. You open it up in Windows Media Viewer, and then I think it's called Show Info, if I recall. And so I bring this up. Usually this is the first thing that comes here, and I just click on this EXIF data, and then look at all this information that the camera has preserved, all this data that the camera, I can look back and I can find, okay, here's the aperture value, here's the serial number of my camera, so my camera got stolen. I could do a little search and see if anybody else's photos mysteriously have the same serial number of body, right? Look at all this. So I'm looking here for, here's my, it says exposure time, which is shutter speed, right? And of course, everybody's got a different way of saying it, but exposure time, 1/1000, right? My F number is 3.6. It even tells me how far zoomed in I was. So focal length, this is 18 millimeters. So on a camera with this kit lens, if I look at the top and it says 18, that's what I was at. So I was zoomed out, right? Versus if I was to zoom in and get appear to get closer to something, I had to be at 55. This here would say 55. The ISO, right? It says photographic sensitivity is 200. Right, so it's bright day. It was overcast, but so I'm at 200. And my aperture, my F, so it says FN number right here, 3.6, right? So ISO 200, F number 3.6, and shutter speed 1/1000. Or sorry, I meant F number, aperture number, is 3.6, right? So those are all this other information means something, but for our purposes is not relevant, right? So this photograph, why this is really helpful to have a photograph like this is, before I go to another photograph, is look at how the background is blurry. And what it does is it creates a separation between her face and the background, right? Because this is a nice sharp focus right around her lips, into her jacket. All of this is in sharp focus, but this is blurry. So it makes it very easy for a viewer looking at the photograph to see literally what the photographer wants us to look at or focus on, right? So this separates the subject from the background or any other images, even possibly from the foreground. Okay, so oh, I'm just gonna make this full screen again. And then, so let's look at, how do I get this next one here? So this is Another photograph with almost identical exposure. So the exposure meter would have been in the same place, but now we've got a different looking image. The same amount of light made it through the camera onto the sensor and created exposure, but the image looks differently because I adjusted the aperture. All right, so now we see my daughter here, but now we can see, oh, I'm just gonna zoom in here. Oops. So let's just zoom in here so that you can see. So now we can see this sign. As you remember, with the previous photograph, this was so blurry we had no idea what it was. We knew it was some kind of sandwich board, but what it was, nobody knows, right? So now we can read all of the text. I can even see the website address in here. It starts to get a little bit, I'm losing the detail out of here, as to be expected, right? Because not only do I see this website address, but I also still see my daughter right here in nice sharp focus. So all of this is, there's nothing inherently wrong with this photograph. It's just different. So what's I think should be exciting for you is to think, oh, okay, that's interesting. Well, now that I know I can manipulate this setting, I could use these different settings for different kinds of purposes. So in this instance, what this does, because everything is now sharp focus, and this would look very similar if I took this on my iPhone, right, or Android or any other phone. This would be very similar to what my iPhone would have taken a photograph, how it would have looked, because again, it has a nice big depth of field. So the thing is, though, is that in this photo, now we have these little, like this back of the truck here, these windows, this tree branch that it now appears to be sort of coming out of her eye, right? All of these things can start kind of interfering with, let's say, my main focus, the focus that I want you to be focusing your attention on is my daughter. Well, now you start getting distracted, like, oh, look at this van here in the background and dumps the garbage. Here's these lights across the street and windows. Maybe there's some person in the window looking really creepy or something. Like, oh, that's weird. So those things are things to consider. So now, again, I've talked about like how we always look for stories in images. In this situation, now it almost appears like my daughter's looking at this sign and there's a conversation happening, even though that sign is, I think it would have been about maybe 4 or 5 meters away, or whatever that is in feet, like 20 feet away, right? So that there's a big separation of space, but because they're all in focus, they all kind of now are in conversation with one another. So it almost sort of looks like she's looking directly at this sign. And I did that purposefully, right? When I saw her looking over this way, I thought, oh, I'm going to move my camera over here, capture that. Whether it turns out to be a good photograph or not, I don't know, but at least I have this kind of captured, right? And then this could be like our daughter looking at the sign, and 20 years later, like, oh wow, like she's if I just ruminate on the story, it's like it looks like she's kind of thinking about it, or that she's looking at it, or there's an awareness of this particular weird situation that we're all going through in the world right now in lockdown, right? So versus, if we go back to this photograph, and I'll just zoom back out, versus this photograph, my daughter's still looking in this direction, but it's not necessarily clear that this is what she's looking at. I mean, she wasn't looking at the sign in either photographs, but whether these two subjects are in conversation with one another, probably less so. All right, so that's just by controlling the, and actually I should show you too the difference, because I had to change. So, okay, so this brings me to another point here. I had to do more than just adjust the shutter speed in this situation. In fact, I believe I probably adjusted all of the settings to get these photographs to have the same exposure, right? So in this first one, maybe I'll even just write this down so that I can refer to it. So in this photo, again, I said let's make a little chart here for ourselves. I think I have aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So aperture, we said, was f3.6. Shutter speed was 1/1000, and the ISO was 200. So in this situation, the aperture is a low number, meaning a lot of light is coming into the camera. Now, the opposite situation, let's bring up the other photograph. So these numbers, let's find them again. Now the shutter speed, exposure time, is 1/250. The F number, aperture number, is 22. And the ISO is 2500. Wow. So that is, virtually the opposite numbers in everything, really. We have, the aperture on one side was, in the first photograph, was the lowest number that this lens could get, right? And so that was 3.6. And then on this photograph you're seeing on the screen now is at f22. So totally different, the polar opposite side of the aperture. The next here, the shutter speed. In the first photograph, I just toggle, no, it won't let me just toggle. So in this photograph, the shutter speed is really fast, 1/1000, right? So if there was a bird flying through the sky up there, it would be it would be out of focus, but it would, in terms of freezing its action, it would be frozen, right? If there was a lightning bolt in the sky, it could also have been frozen, right? Versus this one is a much faster shutter speed. 1/250 means that it would do a pretty good job of freezing action, but if there was somebody riding their bicycle by in the background, they would be kind of blurry, a little bit blurry. And then if we go back up to here, our ISO, so this is the ISO 200 means it's the lowest ISO number that this camera body was capable of getting. Some cameras can go down to 150 or 100 or 80 maybe. So it's the least sensitive the ISO could possibly be, and we're at 200. So there is the camera has its sort of volume or gain turned all the way down. So that means that this photograph, and I wonder if we probably won't be able to see too much difference here. So we're going to zoom right in on her eye here. And then this next photograph, this was at 2500. So the ISO is gone up a lot. Oh, good. I'm glad that we can start seeing a little bit of this here. So let's now look at the difference in ISO. So when those photographs were all the way zoomed out, they both looked pretty darn good, right? But when we look at them at this close, and you're probably not looking at photos that close that often, look at the difference in sharpness. So this photograph, look at how each eyelash we can see, right? Nice sharp. We can see the little hairs on her eyebrows and her face and her lips. Oh, I love it so much. She's so beautiful. But then we go down to here and we're looking at this photograph with substantially higher ISO, and now look at the detail. Look how kind of, I don't know if that really comes across on your computer screen, but on mine, this is like her eyebrows totally disappeared virtually now, right? These eyelashes, we can tell they're eyelashes, but they're kind of like little blobs of color, right? Remember all those little hairs on her lip and her forehead, and even the hair, these little fibers in the hat, they're all kind of pixelated and noisy and chunky, right? There's very little, they don't have that crisp level of detail that we had in this image, right? I can keep on zooming in to the point where, if I zoom in here, right? Yeah, it's falling apart a little bit, but I'm going like, I don't know, 600% into this photograph. Okay, so does that make sense? Let me see. Oh, this camera. I wanted to show you some stuff with this camera here, but I can't. Well, I'm gonna bring that. Okay. So I wonder if I want to do a little bit of unplugging of equipment here. That's frustrating. That's not working. Oh, maybe it's because of this falling off. My apologies for the delay. Again, if you've got photos you want to send me, please do that now. Oh, okay, good. Here we go. So let's, so what I want you to do is take your camera out. We're going to take some photographs, and I want you to play around along with me here and see if you can take some photographs using the different aperture values on your camera. So what's the best way for me to do this? In fact, actually, I just have to make a quick change. Okay. HDMI output on. So I'm going to bring up another screen here. So we have this. Okay, I got a little bit of freezing happening here. Okay, my apologies. It's not happening the way I wanted it to go. Oh, come on. I wonder if everything's working on your end, if people are watching this fine. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty here. Come on. Okay, this is, let me see. Well, okay, so this is my camera here. I'm not able to get the picture-in-picture working the way I want it to be, so this will be a little bit of an experiment. So here's all the junk here on this table. And to begin with, so you've got your camera. You can see that I'm adjusting all the settings. Right now I'm turning the aperture dial. So I'm at f22 f2. And you can see when I'm at f22, without doing any other changes, everything's really, really dark. So the number went really high, but simultaneously the little opening in my camera has shrunk down. And so there's very little light coming into the camera. So I'm going to crank it all the way to the other side, and you can see it brightening back up. Right? Let's just, while I can show you this here, let's, I've got a couple of things I want to set up here. Okay, so we've got this little character. So you don't usually see all of this messiness on camera here. So, move that screen out of the way. So in this scenario, if I focus on this sculpture, which is really close to the camera, so I might just move it back a little bit, because if things are too close to the lens, the camera can have a real hard time focusing on that kind of stuff. Okay, so you see here, we are at, this is a pretty good exposure. It's a little bit bright. So I'm going to turn the shutter. So that's making it brighter. See, the shutter speed's now at 30 frames a second. Now this is different shooting video than it is taking photographs. But so if I darken this right now, it might be a little bit too dark there. So if I brighten it up, okay. So sorry, that looks pretty good for my taste. Well, so you can see on the left side is my exposure meter, and right now I like this photograph despite the fact that it is technically, according to the camera, it feels it's a little bit overexposed. Now the problem is that this this light over here, and then I don't know what, oh, there's a reflection in a mirror way back there. They are pretty bright, so I don't want it, if I brighten this up, or it's going to blow out those areas. So, right, if I keep on going, it's way overexposed. So I want to try to keep this down. Okay. So we're at f 2.8, if your lens can get there, and you can now my camera's on a tripod, right? I've got this little mini tripod here. It's so bummed out that I can't get my camera's to split view right in this exact moment. I've been practicing all day to get it to work. So now let's just make some adjustments here. So we're at f2.8, ISO 1250. I'm going to now start cranking this up. So even, I'm going to go to f8. Now it's too dark. So how do I get more light into the camera? Well, one way is I could move my shutter speed and slow it down, right? And that only goes so far. It's because this now, when I'm filming, the lowest shutter speed I can go is 1/30th of a second. So the next thing I need to do is adjust my, oh, darn it. These cameras, while you're filming, it won't let me adjust my, oh, let's turn I was recording that. Okay, so let's brighten this up. So now we're 3200. That was a little bit too bright, so let's bring it back down to 2000. Now you see, it's saying I'm way too dark But I don't know, I kind of feel like if I went too much brighter here, because that's what the camera's saying I need to go even further. So that's the camera says that this is a good exposure. I don't know. I guess it's okay. I personally like photographs a little bit darker, so I would kind of go personally somewhere around there, and then I can always brighten up, because I don't want to lose the detail. If you look at, there's a, I'll just kind of run over here. If you see this area in this mirror over here, I don't want that to disappear. So, because if I go higher, you see how I just start losing information there, versus if I come back down, I see texture back there. So I can always bring it back up on the computer later on. So the first thing you should notice is now we can see this figure. You could see a lot more detail in this picture. And I'm at f8. So now let's keep on going. Let's crank it all the way to f22. Now, way darker, obviously. And the only setting I have left that I can adjust to allow more light is my ISO again. All right, so I got to crank this up. Now I'm at the highest it will go. And I wonder if this will allow me to pinch and zoom. Can I? No, it won't allow me to do that on this camera. But right now, you can even see in the far background that the blinds across the room, you can see the different kind of stripes of the blinds. Now, it's not perfectly detailed because there's a lot of noise, right? My ISO is at its highest level that it can possibly go. So I have a lot of things in focus, but the level of sharpness has gone down dramatically. So one thing that we could do, let me see, I wonder if I can switch this to, you know what I should have been doing? Okay, I should have been in photo settings. So, and this will apply to what we're gonna do in a few, next week. But so let's say I go down to ISO 400, f22, and then I can now slow my shutter speed down here. And so look at this. Right now, what I'm looking at is a 2.5 second long exposure at f22, and I'm focused on this figure in the front, and I'm just going to take a picture. Let's review that photograph. Okay, so we're looking at the photograph I just took on the camera. It was a 2.5 second long exposure, right? So the camera was open for 2.5 seconds, and we've got this, everything's in focus, but I'm just going to let's do this again, and so I'm going to go put my ISO down to its lowest that it'll go, right? And that's going to mean my shutter speed's going to have to come up to, this will be a little preview of what we're going to do next week. So f22, 6.5 second long. I can run around in here. And then, so I ran in front of the picture. Let's see what this looks like. Huh. So I'm going to try that again. And it looks like it was actually even just a little bit too dark. So I'm just going to make, actually, so let's go even higher. 10 seconds long. And now it's got to process for a second, and then let's take a look at this photograph. Can you see in this photograph that ghostly image of me right next to the arm of that figure? Pretty weird stuff. Okay, so I'm just going to bring this back here, and we're going to come back on camera. So, what I want you to do over the next couple of days is to play around with your camera as much as possible, switching back and forth between low f numbers and high f numbers, or low aperture value number or high aperture value number, right? So that involves a little bit of playing around with your exposure meter and adjusting some other settings. I'm not saying this is going to be easy at first. It's certainly a little bit more complicated, but I really believe that if you play around with this, you're really going to start understanding the power of your camera to take some really, really amazing photographs. I think controlling the aperture is going to unlock the true power of your camera. So, and the only way for you to do that is to practice. I'm sure there's a few people just watching, but you won't fully get everything you need out unless you start playing with your camera. And you could see the photographs I just took here I'm not going to submit them for the cover of the National Geographic. I'm not concerned with, how pretty they look, or I'm not organizing a really cool scene, which you could do. You could, if you want to spend some time organizing your composition, you could do that as well. But what I would rather you spend your time doing is trying to play with the aperture and just see if you can get one thing in focus, like something in the foreground, and then see if you can keep opening up that depth of field, so that you get more and more things in focus. Now again, the bigger the depth of field, more things in focus, you're going to need more and more light. So you have to adjust the settings to allow it to be more sensitive, to allow more light to get into the camera. Which is why, probably one of the most famous photographers of all time, Ansel Adams, who is sort of like the grandfather of photography as a serious art form. He's famous for, maybe I can, I'm not gonna, maybe I will see if, we'll just see if we can pull up a Ansel Adams here on because, okay, let's go to images here, Ansel Adams. Because I talk about it, you might want to know who I'm talking about. Let's make this full screen. All right, so here's just some quick images by Ansel Adams of these beautiful, this is a super high depth of field, right? Like we see these stones in the foreground. And then look how much distance there must be before we get to the edge. You can see the edge of this mountain. We can see the crisp little fingers off of these clouds, right? So giant distances. This is another famous photograph, right? Like we can see the ripples in this river. We can see the snow, right? And so when these photographs can be blown up really, really, really big. So Ansel Adams is the kind of master of landscape photography, and also just like, he lived, I don't know, off the top of my head, let's see, I should probably, 1902 to 1984, right? And he's primarily, along with a few other photographers, known for really establishing photography as a serious art form, as I said. Okay, so play with your camera as much as possible. Really understand, if you're doing this, it's going to also make you get more familiar with how to adjust your ISO and shutter speed as well, because you're going to have to change them in order to allow more light or less light into the camera accordingly, right? So you're kind of keeping an eye on your exposure meter, and take the photographs that look best to you. Don't worry about necessarily exactly what the exposure meter is telling you. If you think it's a good photograph, take the photograph. But it's also important to take that photograph, your camera, plug it into your computer, see what they look like on your computer, because you've got this little tiny screen on the back here, and photographs can look really great on here, and then you put it on your computer, and then you're like, oh, that's a crummy photograph. It's all blurry. I didn't realize all the eyes were out of focus. So that's why it's really important to take your photographs off of your camera as frequently as possible so that you can start to get to know your camera a little bit better. You don't want to take thousands of photographs on your camera, you know, for months and months and months, put them onto your computer after a long vacation and realize, oh, this whole time I had, oh, look at all these fingerprints and there's ketchup right on the front lens. I wish I knew that, you know, 2 months ago before the wedding or whatever, right? So if you're looking at your photos more frequently, you're going to catch those little details. Okay. So, let's see. If there are any comments or questions, well, the video is blurry. Yeah, there was some kind of weird internet foible that happened there for a little bit. I had some kind of warning sign light up on here, which caused me to panic for a second. Maria sent me a photo on Twitter. So let me see if I can track that down. I saw it there for a second and it disappeared. Where did it go? I'm trying to remember. It didn't immediately come up here, Maria, so I'm trying to remember what your Twitter handle was here. I don't know if you tagged me on your photo or not here. Oh, here I go. Okay, so I'm going to bring this up here. And again, I wish I could, I don't know why this system is not allowing me to show. So here's some photos. I'm assuming these are the ones, oh yeah, from Markowsky Art. Okay. Cool. People painting some murals here. Was this right downtown? Is this on, right off of Burrard, right? This is beautiful. Okay, so you know what? I'm gonna drag. I'm gonna copy this to desktop, or actually, I'll do, while we're right here, I'll do a little bit of photo editing here. Since, ooh, look at these. So I'm just going to download them, and that way I can then really quickly pull them up and then give you some even more detailed feedback. Oh, look at, you took a lot of great photos. Okay. Here. Maybe with these. So I'll just give you some comments on these right off the top. This is fantastic. I like this long, you know, these leading lines that lead us deep into the image here. So we have like this train station. I think one of the things is if our eyes are being drawn deep into the photograph like that, you know, what is the payoff for us? Is there something down here that we want, that you're trying to draw our attention to? That would be a question. So in this instance, it might have been nice to have to see the train kind of just appearing right over top. Oh, I'll bring this back here. It would have been nice to see the train just sort of appearing at the end of the tracks, or maybe somebody standing here, like if like you could be doing a fashion photo shoot, somebody modeling some outfit, or a dancer dancing here, or somebody sprinting towards the camera, or somebody in a funny costume, you know, so on and so on, right? So what are these, because this photograph is pulling our attention down into this point, and it just sort of trails off. So it's not that it needs to be there, but it's just a question for you. When you're doing something like that with a lot of depth, is there something there? This is great. So this is, I haven't actually been on public transit since all this started happening, so I didn't realize this is what they were doing. So this is great. I'm glad that you captured this kind of an image, because it really kind of shows what is happening in our world right now. So, you know, every second seat is blocked off for people's protection. So this works really well. One thing, and you know what, I'm going to save this to our folder as well, because I have a feeling, I wonder if we'll be able to bring up the data on here. Okay, look how we go from that photo to this photo. That's a great contrast, because look how crowded it is on this train versus before. Ah, look at this. All this text kind of talking about this crazy situation we're in right now. So where did I put all these different things? Okay, here we go. So let's open these up. So it doesn't look like, just based on the way that these photos have come across and been compressed, that it's not showing us any of the information as to, you know, as to the length of the lens and all that kind of stuff. But so if I'm looking at this photograph, this did look to me like a little bit of stuff out of focus, and I think that's probably your shutter speed was a little bit too slow. So this looks like maybe you were at 1/30th of a second or 1/10 of a second, and so you've got the camera shake happening, where the camera is not steady enough for that shutter speed. So we get a tiny bit of blur. Not, you know, again, when we talk about these kind of things, it's always a balancing act. A technically perfectly taken photograph, you know, where all of the settings are exactly right technically, does not guarantee that it's going to be a good photograph. Like, let's say, for instance, there was somebody on this seat here who got a text saying that she won $1 million, and leaps up and starts celebrating, and you just quickly take a picture of it, and everything's all blurry, but you capture that look on her face of excitement and joy, right? And then she's still jumping around, and then you take you a little bit more time, you can make your settings even better, and then you take a photograph, but it doesn't quite capture that same level of excitement. Well, which photograph is the quote-unquote better photograph, right? So it's just another thing to think about. So we'll talk for another 5 minutes here, and then so this one is great. Again, it works really nice in contrast. These are two really interesting images going back to back. One thing, I mean, just if I was to nitpick, what I would say would be really neat is if you could try to compose the picture in the same sort of way, so that you're literally, because this one looks like I would imagine you took this photograph here from like waist height, kind of in the middle of I know this is a train and the other one's a bus, but if you could try to orient them so that they're just sort of, they line up on top of one another better. I think this one's probably also taken from the hip as well, which is a common kind of street photography. This is great. I like this. Composition, I like that, you know, one of the tendencies people do when they're taking street photography is always getting everything very symmetrical, standing directly across the street, and so that the street, you know, everything is aligned parallel to the top and bottom of the camera or the computer screen or whatever, right? Whereas this one, we have these diagonals, and it's just a much more dynamic photograph. You know, there's this little car that's moving and slightly blurry. I would think like maybe the not waiting for a time where there's no car there, or there is a car, you know. But I like these cones. They also bring in sucker eye back down into the picture, because all of this text usually draws our attention more than anything. This one here is, I think just it feels a little bit crooked, right? Like we have these angles. I wonder. Let's actually see. I haven't used this software for. It doesn't look like we can do much editing in terms of straightening this photograph. On Photoshop, we could do that, but I'm not going to bring that up because I don't think most people have it. But it'd just be one thing to think about, like align. See how this is on an angle, this is on an angle, right? If the camera, so that just sort of looks like the camera was just a little bit crooked when you took the picture. So, you know, you could fix this later on the computer. If you don't have the software, that's a little bit trickier to do. You just want to kind of rotate it a little bit back. I mean, it's a small comment, but then another thing that I'm noticing, and this is why you want to take your photos off your cameras. I see on a few of these photos, you see these here look like there's something on. Well, maybe this is on the window of the train. I was gonna say maybe this is on the lens of your camera, but I thought there was something elsewhere too. No? Yeah, so it looks like could be something on your camera lens, or hopefully not on the sensor of your camera. So if you're noticing things like this that are always appearing there, I don't know offhand. This could be just reflections from this light inside of the camera, or it could be something dirty on the. Yeah, it looks like there's something. So that would be something just to take a look at. And if you want to use, you know, like a little cloth to clean the lens of your camera. In terms of cleaning the inside of your camera, you know, so let's say you know, if you take your and you can also clean the inside of the lens too. So you could use a cloth to really delicately clean the lens, but I would not use that to clean the sensor itself, because then you could accidentally. This is the money right here. If you scratch the inside of your lens or your sensor, then you're out of luck, right? So there are things that you can buy. You could take your camera to get cleaned somewhere. If you're kind of careful with when you take your lens on and off, and you don't leave a lens off, like you would never want to take this lens off and just leave the camera sitting on a coffee table for more than 20 seconds, right? You wouldn't want to leave this out overnight or for a couple of weeks and allow dust to accumulate on it. That would be a small disaster. These are cool. So these moon photos, this looks, you know, to do anything like this, you're going to need a tripod for sure, and you need to take a little bit longer exposures. So I don't know how long of an exposure, sorry, these moon photos are. But that is pretty darn nice, isn't it? Look at that. Beautiful. I mean, it's far away, and so when I zoom in, it's losing detail, but that's to be expected. But I think, you know, for if you took this handheld, because that one looks like it was handheld, then you did a pretty good job. Okay. I'm wondering if there's any other feedback I can give you on these photos. Maybe just really quickly, and then we'll call it a day. Is, you know, this photograph here on the Sky Train, again, these little blobs in the sky are a little distracting. If you have a software like Photoshop, you can really easily edit that out. If not, it just kind of becomes a little annoying. you know, this looks more like just a vacation photograph, a little snapshot. You know, and the difference is it doesn't feel like there's as much attention to composition as there could be. Like, I like these leading lines pulling us into here. That works really well. And it is kind of asymmetrical, right? So we kind of move from one side to the other. But what I would suggest is actually backing up a little bit. So, you know, the tendency in a photo like this, when you're taking a photograph out the window of a train or a bus or an airplane, is to really put your camera right up against the glass to take this photograph. But what I would actually suggest is coming back out a little bit so that we see a little bit of the frame of the window. Let's say you're on an airplane. Instead of putting your camera right up, like, get some of the frame of the window itself in there, you know, or some of the little rivets or whatever is in there, a crack in there, and see if, because that can add a little something, give us context to the image itself. Okay, so that's a lot of talking for me, and probably a lot of information for you watching. So I think I'll call it a day for now. Okay. Just some little things about Maria's settings on those photos. F18. You know, so I'm not sure which one was 1/4 of a second, but that's a very slow shutter speed. Next week, we're going to spend 2 classes talking about shutter speed and how to take longer exposures or even faster exposures. But 1/4 of a second is definitely tripod level. So I don't know if that was one of the ones on the bus or if that was your moon photo. I would imagine if you're taking photographs of the moon, you'd probably want to be going a little bit slower than that. You'd be going into like 1 or 2 seconds long at least, right? Okay. So your homework, should you choose to accept it, is to take photographs playing with your aperture. Try your f1.4 or 2.8 or 3.5 or whatever the lowest aperture setting on your camera can go to, or your camera or the lens, depending on the make and model of your camera. And then try going all the way up to the top. So going to f22 or f32 or f18. Some cameras only go up to f9 or 12. So there's quite a range of abilities for different cameras. So, and just switch back and forth and see how that changes the subject for the background and foreground. Like how the blurry background can really focus our attention onto whatever's in the center, and versus having all of the background focus. It's really going to change the story that people get when they look at your image. So, having said all that, again, I really appreciate everyone for sticking around for so long and for watching, despite any kind of maybe technical difficulties there may have been throughout there. It's always a little bit of a challenge for me to get all this technical stuff working, and it's so I appreciate your support. If you wouldn't mind liking this video before you head out, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and if you're feeling so generous, you can send any level of denomination through a PayPal link below there. We will see you on Wednesday, and if you've done all this, it's going to get even more exciting because we're going to see where we can go from there. Okay, everybody, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we will see you then. Bye-bye.